Hey everybody, and welcome to the deep dive. It's Halloween, so we're going to do a special Halloween deep dive into death in the afterlife.
Ooh, spooky.
Yeah. We're going to be taking all your sources and diving deep into them to really try to unpack and figure out, what are the big questions here?
Exactly. And what better time to tackle this topic than Halloween, right? I mean, think about it. It's that time of year when the veil between the worlds is supposed to be thinnest. All those ghost stories start coming out.
Oh, yeah. Have you ever, had a really creepy experience that made you think twice about,
Oh, absolutely.
ghosts or
I'm not going to lie, I get spooked pretty easily, especially this time of year.
Yeah, me too. Well, let's get into some of those spooky stories and see what our listeners sent us. But before we get to those stories, I actually came across something super interesting while I was prepping for this deep dive. Did you know that Halloween itself has roots in this ancient Celtic festival called Samhain?
It's funny you should mention that because that was something I was going to bring up as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? I mean, think about it. It's the end of the harvest season. The days are getting shorter and people are starting to think about, death and that whole cycle of life and death.
Okay, yeah, that definitely sets the mood for Halloween. So what's the connection to Halloween? How did it go from Samhain to trick-or-treating?
Well, the Celts believed that on the eve of their new year, which was October 31st, the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead became super thin.
Oh, so ghosts could just wander around?
Exactly. They thought spirits could cross over, and it was a time to both honor the dead and also, kind of fear them,
Wow, so it's like Halloween, but with, real ghosts.
Right. Pretty intense.
No wonder we still get a little freaked out this time of year. Okay, so enough about the history of Halloween. Let's get to those spooky stories you mentioned.
No, okay, bring them on.
All right, so there's this one about this guy driving late at night on a deserted road, and he sees what he thinks is his friend walking on the side of the road.
Okay, I've heard this one before.
Yeah, so he pulls over,
Yeah.
right? Because he's like, oh my God, what are you doing out here? But when he turns to offer his friend a ride,
poof,
the friend's gone, vanished into thin air.
It's a classic. It's is it just our minds playing tricks on us, especially when we're already in that Halloween mindset?
Yeah, right? Yeah. Or is it something more? Okay, but this next one is even creepier. This guy is driving along, and every time he checks his rearview mirror, he sees this creepy smiling face staring at him from the back of a van that's been following him.
Oh, that's a hard no for me. I would not be okay with that.
Imagine seeing that in your rearview mirror.
Ugh. Gives me chills just thinking about it. But it is interesting, right, how these stories tap into our primal fears, The darkness, the unknown. It makes us question what's real and what's not.
Totally. And that leads us to the big question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there actually life after death? I mean, those stories are creepy, but are they actually evidence of something more?
It's the ultimate mystery, isn't it? And, we connect this to the bigger picture. There's a long history of debate about the afterlife. On one side, you have people who believe in spiritual continuation.
Okay.
So it's the idea that some part of us, like our soul or consciousness, survives after our physical bodies die.
Okay, so we don't just blink out of existence when we die.
Exactly. And this belief often comes from religious or spiritual traditions, but it can also be based on personal experiences like those ghost stories we were just talking about.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, I think the idea of an afterlife, it offers comfort and meaning, right? It helps them cope with the fear of death and gives them hope that maybe they'll be reunited with loved ones who have passed on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if you believe in karma or some kind of cosmic justice system, it can definitely influence how you live your life.
Right, you better be good in this life or else.
Exactly. But on the flip side, you have those who argue that there's just no scientific evidence to support the existence of an afterlife. They see those near-death experiences and ghost sightings as explainable phenomena.
Like what?
Like hallucinations, maybe caused by oxygen deprivation to the brain, or just our brains trying to make sense of the unknown.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've definitely had some weird dreams that felt super real, so I can imagine how our brains could trick us into thinking something supernatural is happening.
Exactly. And then there's the whole psychological aspect too, right?
Oh, yeah, the idea of an afterlife might just be a way for us to cope with the very human fear of not existing anymore.
Right. It's a comforting thought, even if it's not necessarily based in reality.
So it's we're wired to want to believe in something more. But then how do you explain those people who had near-death experiences and claim to have seen things they couldn't possibly have known otherwise? I was reading about this woman who had surgery, and while she was unconscious, she accurately described things that were happening in the operating room. Like specific conversations the doctors were having.
That's pretty wild.
Oh, no, right? It's like her
Yeah.
consciousness was separate from her body.
Yeah, those are the stories that really make you wonder. And that's where things get really interesting, and we start to delve into things like quantum consciousness.
Yeah, whoa, hold on. You can't just drop quantum consciousness and then not explain it.
Okay, fair enough. But before we go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, we're going down the rabbit hole. You mentioned it now, you got to explain it. What is quantum consciousness?
Okay, so imagine the world of quantum mechanics is like the Wild West of physics. It's all about tiny particles behaving in ways that completely defy our everyday logic. Things can exist in multiple states at once. It's all probabilities and uncertainty.
I'm already lost.
I know it's mind-bending. But here's the thing. Some scientists think these weird quantum processes might be happening in our brains, too.
Wait, so you're saying there might be a connection between the strangeness of quantum physics and, like, the mystery of consciousness?
Exactly. And if that's true, then it opens up some really wild possibilities about what happens to our consciousness after death. Maybe it doesn't just disappear. Maybe it transitions to a different state of being.
Okay, now, that is both spooky and fascinating. It's like science fiction meeting real science. But hold on, if we're going to talk about near-death experiences and potential evidence for the afterlife, we have to get into some specific examples from the sources.
Absolutely. Let's hear them.
Like,
because those firsthand accounts are really what fuel this whole debate.
Okay, so one story that really stuck with me was about this guy who had a near-death experience during surgery, and he claimed to have seen his own operation from above, like he was floating near the ceiling, and could describe details about the surgery that he couldn't have known otherwise.
That's a classic out-of-body experience.
Right. It's like his consciousness was literally detached from his physical body.
It really challenges our conventional understanding of how the brain and consciousness work. It suggests that maybe consciousness isn't simply a product of brain activity, but something more fundamental, something that might even be able to exist independently of the body.
This is where my brain starts to hurt.
I know, right?
But it's also so intriguing. So what do the skeptics say about these kinds of experiences? There has to be like a more scientific explanation, right?
Of course. And that's where we start to delve into the fascinating world of neuroscience and how our brains respond to extreme stress or trauma. Because while those near-death experiences might feel super real and profound to the people who have them.
You're going to tell me it's all just chemicals and neurons firing, right?
Well, not necessarily just chemicals, but there is a growing body of research that suggests these near-death experiences can be explained by physiological changes in the brain. Like, when the brain is deprived of oxygen, it can trigger hallucinations and unusual sensations.
So like seeing a bright light or feeling like you're floating.
Exactly, and that feeling of peacefulness and euphoria that people often report, that could just be a rush of endorphins released as the brain is under stress.
So are you saying those experiences are basically just really intense dreams?
It's not quite that simple. We're still learning so much about how the brain works and what consciousness really is. But it's definitely a possibility that at least some of these experiences can be explained by brain chemistry.
Okay, that makes sense. But then where does that leave us? If we can't totally trust our own experiences and science hasn't figured it all out yet, can we ever truly know what happens to our consciousness after death?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one that philosophers and scientists have been grappling with for centuries. There are brilliant minds on both sides of this debate, each offering really compelling arguments. But I think the key takeaway is that we can't dismiss the experiences people have had, whether they can be fully explained by science or not. Because even if those experiences are ultimately rooted in brain chemistry, they still have a profound impact on people's lives.
I agree. It's like, even if it's just your brain playing tricks on you, it doesn't mean those feelings and experiences aren't real and meaningful to the person going through them.
Absolutely. And for some people, those experiences are totally life-changing. They may become less afraid of death or more focused on living a meaningful life. So even without definitive proof of an afterlife, these explorations can have a real impact on how we live our lives.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about these anecdotal accounts, these fascinating stories, but are there any like researchers or scientists who are actually taking this idea of an afterlife seriously?
Oh, absolutely. There are some big names who've dedicated their entire careers to studying these phenomena.
Okay, give me the highlights. Like, who should we be looking into?
Well, one of the most well-known is Dr. Raymond Moody. He's a psychiatrist who, back in the 70s, actually coined the term near-death experience. And he's been collecting and analyzing these accounts for decades.
Okay, so what has he found? Like, give me the Cliff Notes version.
Well, Moody noticed some striking similarities in the near-death experiences that people reported. Many described a feeling of leaving their bodies, seeing a bright light, or encountering deceased loved ones. Some even report having a life review where they see key moments from their lives flash before their eyes.
Wow, that would be intense, like a cosmic highlight reel of your life. But wouldn't a skeptic say that those are just hallucinations caused by the brain, like shutting down?
Of course, skeptics have their explanations, but Moody argues that the consistency of these experiences across different cultures and backgrounds suggests there might be something more to it than just brain chemistry. It's not just random hallucinations, it's like there's a pattern.
Okay, I'm listening.
Another researcher worth mentioning is Dr. Bruce Grayson. He's a psychiatrist who's been studying near-death experiences from a more scientific perspective. He even developed a scale for measuring the features of these experiences.
Wait, there's a scale for near-death experiences. Okay, I got to know more about this.
It's called the Grayson NDE scale, and it looks at things like whether the person felt separated from their body, had a sense of timelessness, encountered a being of light, or had a life review. It's basically a way to try to quantify these experiences and see if there are any patterns.
So, what conclusions has Dr. Grayson drawn from his research? Has he come down on one side of the afterlife debate or the other?
He's very careful not to make any definitive statements about the existence of an afterlife. But his research has led him to believe that near-death experiences really challenge our current understanding of consciousness. He argues that there might be more to the mind than just brain activity.
Makes you wonder what else is out there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But didn't one of our sources mention Stephen Hawking? I thought he was pretty firmly in the consciousness ends with the brain camp.
Yeah, Hawking was definitely a brilliant mind, and he believed that consciousness was a product of the brain and would cease to exist after death. He even compared the brain to a computer, saying that when the hardware breaks down, the program stops running.
So a pretty materialistic view, no room for a soul or spirit or anything like that.
Exactly. But even Hawking acknowledged that there are still many mysteries about the brain and consciousness that we just haven't solved yet.
I guess we'll never know for sure until we experience it ourselves.
Right. The ultimate mystery. But until then, it's fascinating to explore all the different perspectives and possibilities. And who knows, maybe someday science will catch up with those who have had these profound experiences and offer us some more concrete answers.
I hope so.
But before we totally shift gears and get away from the spooky stuff, I did want to touch on one more thing from the sources. It's about the whole idea of consciousness and whether it can actually exist outside the body.
Okay, yeah, we were getting into some pretty mind-bending stuff there.
Right. And I think it's worth exploring a bit further because it's like, if consciousness isn't just a product of our physical brains, then what does that mean for the afterlife?
Exactly. It's like, does our consciousness just kind of float around in the ether, or does it go somewhere specific?
Right. And what does that even feel like? Is it like being asleep, or is it something completely different?
I know, it's too much for my brain to handle right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I do remember one of the sources mentioned something about the potential for consciousness to be like information that's stored or transferred.
Maybe our consciousness is like this entangled information. Mm-hmm. And when our physical bodies die, that information doesn't just disappear. It might get transferred or entangled with something else.
So like our consciousness could become part of some kind of like cosmic network.
Exactly. It's a pretty wild idea, but it's out there.
Okay, well, my brain officially hurts now. But it's fascinating to think about. So if our consciousness could potentially exist outside our bodies, does that mean we could actually communicate with people who have died?
That's the big question, right? And it's one that a lot of people are trying to answer. There are mediums and psychics who claim to be able to communicate with the dead.
Yeah, but I've always been skeptical about that stuff. Like, how do you know they're not just making it up?
That's fair. A lot of people are skeptical. And it's important to approach these things with a critical mind. But there have been some pretty compelling cases where mediums have provided information that they couldn't have known otherwise, like specific details about a deceased person's life that only close family members would know.
Interesting. So you're saying it's at least possible that we could communicate with the dead?
I think it's worth considering. But even if we can't talk to them directly, maybe they're still out there somewhere, watching over us, or maybe even sending us signs.
Like pennies from heaven.
Exactly. Or maybe a song on the radio that reminds you of someone you've lost. Or a butterfly that seems to follow you around.
Okay, now that's getting a little too woo-woo for me, even for a Halloween special. But I do get what you're saying. It's like, even if we can't prove or disprove the existence of an afterlife, it's still comforting to think that our loved ones might still be out there in some form.
Right. It's about holding on to that hope and that connection.
Okay, well, on that heartwarming note, I think we need to lighten things up a bit. What do you say we take a break from all this death talk and shift gears to something a little more fun?
Sounds good to me.
All right, everybody. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back to talk about something a little less spooky. Stay tuned. All right, everybody, welcome back to the deep dive. So before the break, we were knee-deep in some pretty heavy stuff,
Death, the afterlife, all that jazz.
Yeah, but, it's Halloween, so I guess it's appropriate. Okay, so after all this deep diving into near-death experiences and quantum consciousness and the arguments for and against an afterlife, where do we land? What are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that death and the question of what happens afterwards is something that has captivated humans for as long as we've been around. And while we may never have definitive proof one way or the other, exploring these ideas can have a profound impact on how we live our lives.
I agree. It's a reminder to appreciate this life and to cherish the moments we have and to be open to the possibility that there might be something more beyond this physical existence.
Beautifully said. And hey, even if you're not convinced about the afterlife, Halloween is still a great time to tap into that sense of mystery and wonder.
Totally. It's a chance to celebrate the unknown, to embrace the spooky and the strange. And, speaking of celebrating, if you're looking for something fun and festive to watch after this episode, I highly recommend checking out Mickytolife on YouTube.
Oh, yeah, I love that channel. Micky does some amazing travel and drink reviews.
Right. It's the perfect blend of adventure and good times. A great way to lighten the mood after a deep dive into the mysteries of death and the afterlife.
Totally agree. So to wrap things up, we want to thank you for joining us on this spooky Halloween journey. Whether you believe in ghost spirits or the possibility of an afterlife, we hope this episode has given you something to think about.
And remember, no matter what you believe, life is precious. So make the most of it. It's like Micky always says, life is too short for boring drinks and predictable destinations.
Ah, so true.
So go subscribe to Mickytolife on YouTube. You won't regret it. We hope this episode has given you something to think about. Happy Halloween, everyone. And until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
Happy Halloween.